Thanks, Mitt. This is the first book that I've co-authored with John Yoo, Jay Bybee, Stephen Bradbury, and it may be the last one that I'll co-author with them, but it did make it quicker to write. I decided to write this, to put these memos together and to write this essay about what happened in the Office of Legal Counsel between 2002 and 2007, because I think in many respects that is where much of the accountability really needs to focus. Not solely on the people in the Office of Legal Counsel, but surely in a principal manner on the people in the Office of Legal Counsel. And I'll try in my opening remarks here to suggest why that is the case, and then our panel is going to discuss what accountability ought to look like, or whether there needs to be accountability at all. So the memos that are included in the book, edited really just to keep out repetition, not to change the arguments, are the memos that set forth the legal rationale for authorizing the CIA to use its, what President Bush called enhanced interrogation techniques on suspects who had been disappeared into CIA secret prisons around the world. And the techniques that were authorized were all the techniques the CIA asked to use, and they include stripping suspects naked, denying them any sleep for up to 11 days straight, restricting their food, slapping them in the stomach and the face, slamming them into walls repeatedly, dousing them with cold water, forcing them into painful stress positions and small dark boxes, and waterboarding them. And the Office of Legal Counsel lawyers, not just John Yoo and Jay Bybee, who get most of the focus, but Dan Levin and Stephen Bradbury, who were their successors as well, and possibly, although we're not entirely sure of his position, Jack Goldsmith, who was in the office during this period as well, all concluded that none of these methods were torture, that none of these methods were even cruel, inhuman, or degrading, that none of them violated the Geneva Convention's requirement that all detainees be treated humanely. And the story about how they reached that judgment is, I think, a story of law at its worst and lawyering at its worst. In my view, law at its best is about constraining power, about protecting the vulnerable, and about expressing our highest ideals. Law at its worst is about being a cloak to power, exploiting the vulnerable, and treating law as infinitely manipulable so that it can rationalize anything that the client wants. It's really the latter approach that these lawyers took rather than the former, and that's the real problem here. What is particularly troubling about that is the role that this office, the Office of Legal Counsel, is supposed to play in our federal government and our constitutional structure. It is often said to be the constitutional conscience of the executive branch. It is the body which is supposed to keep the executive, which is charged with enforcing the law, within the law itself. Whenever the executive has some question about the legality of some measure that it seeks to employ, it goes to this office and asks for an official legal opinion on whether what it wants to do is legal or not. The office has many, it's a very coveted job. It has many distinguished alumni, among them Chief Justice Rehnquist, Justice Scalia, former Solicitors General Ted Olson and Walter Dellinger, Yale Law School Dean and now State Department Legal Advisor Harold Koh, Yale President Benno Schmidt, and on our own faculty, Alex Alenikoff, Vicki Jackson, Marty Lederman, and one Nina Pillard. So this is an office that has had some extremely good lawyers, and for an important reason. On many issues, this is the only office that, the only entity that determines the legality of executive action. With respect to covert activity, which is what this was, it's unlikely that Congress is ever going to be involved or the courts are ever going to be involved. And so it's the Office of Legal Counsel that is the sort of has the final say, not the Supreme Court. And in particular here, where they were adjudicating essentially how these individuals who had been disappeared into secret CIA prisons could be treated, they were the only line of defense for these individuals. They were cut off, the detainees, that is, were cut off from any access to the outside world whatsoever. And so if anybody was going to protect them, it was the Office of Legal Counsel. And if anybody was going to say no, it was the Office of Legal Counsel. And had they said no, you can't waterboard people, slam them into walls, keep them awake for 11 days to try to get them to talk when they're not otherwise willing, then I don't think this program would ever have gotten off the ground. It's quite possible that Dick Cheney would not have taken no for an answer. He may have put tremendous pressure on the office to change its view, but the whole idea of this office is that it's supposed to be resistant to that type of pressure. That's its purpose. That's its, the reason we have such an office and not just a White House counsel office. But once they said yes, that saying yes is effectively a get-out-of-jail-free card, as Jack Goldsmith has described it, for anyone who acts pursuant to their policy. And that policy was applied not only in the CIA black sites, but ultimately drove the policy that led to torture at Guantanamo under a policy approved by Donald Rumsfeld, and that was then transmitted to Afghanistan and then via special operating forces back to Iraq and ultimately led to Abu Ghraib. So in many respects, this was sort of the original sin from which all of the torture that that our country practiced in the wake of 9/11 stemmed. And one of the things that's most troubling is that there are difficult questions here, difficult lines to draw. There's no doubt about that. But one might expect that if the lawyers were in fact providing objective legal advice, they would reach a nuanced result in which they say some tactics are okay, some tactics are not. In fact, what they said was that everything was okay, and they said it continuously over a 5-year period, even as the law changed in public to make it more clear that these tactics were illegal and impermissible. The Office of Legal Counsel continued to write memos in secret affirming to the CIA that they can continue to engage in these very activities. They continued to do this even after they learned, because of a 2004 report by the Inspector General of the CIA, that the CIA had abused these tactics quite substantially. They continued to use them even after they learned from that same report that there was no evidence that these tactics had unearthed evidence which could not have been obtained using lawful, non-coercive interrogation tactics. And even after they had learned again from that report that no ticking time bombs of any kind were averted as a result of this entire enterprise. And even as we got further and further away from the crisis period in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, they continued to say each and every tactic was permissible. I want to just say a couple of words about how they got there. What are the kinds of arguments that they employed? Much of the attention to date has focused on one memo in particular. That's the August 1st, 2002 memo that John Yoo wrote and Jay Bybee signed, that interprets this torture statute generally.